Hello friends, here I am with new story. I hope you all like the video and subscribe to my channel. So let's start the video with summary. Trust me, little one, immortality is a curse. If you are ever offered the chance to live forever, think very carefully before accepting. Take it from me, immortality is my curse. I have seen everything fall around me, and I curse the poor fool who think this is a blessing. Chapter 1, A Curse of Life. Come on Annabeth. We need to keep moving. Thalia Grace yelled out as she ran with a small girl next to her through a dark forest. I'm trying Thalia, she cried out as she followed the older girl. Behind the two of them, a young boy came up on them and ran besides them. I bought us some time, but we need to keep moving, he yelled as the three kept running. Thalia spared a glance over at the boy before looking behind them when whatever was chasing them roared out in anger. The punk girl cursed under her breath before stopping, a spear appearing in her hand. Shut up! She roared out as lightning struck her spear and shot out towards the beast. She didn't stick around to see if she hit or not as she turned to catch up with her friends, but the loud, pain-filled roar clued her in that she hit whatever it was. Annabeth looked at the tall boy running with them with a worried look on her face. Look, what is that? She asked the blonde boy. Luke glanced behind them and shook his head. Hellhound, a big hellhound, he breathed out as he kept running. Thalia caught up with the two just as Annabeth tumbled to the ground. She cried out as she fell to the ground. She hissed in pain as she felt a jolt go up her leg. Thalia looked at the small blonde girl and stopped and crouched next to her. You okay, Annie? She asked the girl. Annabeth whimpered out in pain and shook her head. Luke looked behind them and noticed the pissed-off hellhound was gaining on them. Gods! We need to move now, he called to the two. Thalia looked at the boy and back to Annabeth. Luke, help me carry Annabeth, she said as she slung one of the girl's arms over her shoulder. Luke nodded and got under her other arm and began to take off with Thalia. We can't get very far like this, Annabeth cried out. We need to find somewhere to hide, she said to the two, earning nods from both teens. As the girl said that, a small opening in the trees caught their eyes. Thalia didn't know why, but the trail that went down that opening seemed to call out to her. Luke, that way, she said as she began to turn. All right, he said as he turned with her and the two carried their friend down the path. About 50 meters down the path they came across a small cabin. A soft light came from the windows of the home and a welcoming air overtook the three. In there Annabeth breathed out, gaining nods from her friends. The three made their way to the front door of the cabin. Thalia made to knock on the door, but before she could, the door opened. Behind the door was a tall man that seemed to be in his mid to late 20s. He had spiked blonde hair and blue eyes that almost seemed to pierce through her soul. But what really caught the three's attention was the 3 whisker marks on each of his cheeks. The man smiled at the three and opened his door fully. Oh, visitors. It's been a while since I've had anyone to entertain. Well, don't be shy, little ones. Come in, he said as he stepped out of the doorway making room for them to enter. Thalia looked to Luke, getting a hesitant nod of approval before they went in. They walked into the house and noticed that it seemed rather homey. There was a large fireplace in the center of the cabin with 2 chairs and a couch surrounding it. There was a small kitchen off to the side and a bed on the other side of the cabin. There was a door in the back of the main room that must have been the bathroom. What was odd about the house was that along one of the walls was what seemed to be a weapons rack filled with strange-looking knives, single-edged blades and ninja throwing stars. The strangest of the weapons had to be the oddly shaped 3-pronged knife in a glass case display. Thalia looked around before helping Luke set Annabeth down on the couch. The punk girl looked over to their host with a curious gaze. She was about to say something but the blonde man quickly cut her off. Oof, wow, that looks bad. Here, let me take a look-see, he said as he shuffled over to Annabeth and took a glance at her ankle. After a second he scratched his chin and hummed lightly. Yup. You definitely have a sprain here, little miss. Here, just give me a second. Before he brought his hands up and hovered them over her ankle. Now, I haven't done this in a long while, so bear with me here, he said, before he let out a long breath. After a long second, a green hue began shining from his hands that steadily increased in brightness and size, until it covered the girl's ankle. Annabeth could instantly feel the pain in her ankle fade as she let out a sigh of relief. Thalia and Luke looked at their blonde host in awe as the swelling in the young girl's ankle instantly went down and lost its dark purple coloring from bruising. How are you doing that? Thalia asked the blonde with a look of awe. Their host looked over at her with a raised eyebrow before his brow furrowed. It's just medical wait, sorry, wrong era for you to even begin to know what that is. Sorry, but I don't know technicalities of what I'm doing. Sorta forgot, sorta never quite understood all the minute details of it to begin with. Like I said, it's been a while, he said to the girl before his eye furrowed. Oh yeah, what are your names, the way? He asked the group. Ty narrowed her eyes at the men before crossing her arms. This guy was weird, and she didn't like it. He made her feel, oddly, both comforted and incredibly intimidated at the same time. But before she could tell him off, the little girl he was tending to spoke up. I am Annabeth Chase, she said to the man. The blonde man turned his head back to his patient and smiled warmly at her, his eyes closing and his whisker marks stretching slightly, giving him a fox-like look. It's nice to meet you, little one. Oh, and by the way, you should stay off your ankle as much as possible for about a day or two, so as not to aggravate it and cause it to swell up again, he instructed her, waiting until he received a nod from the blonde girl. The other blonde of their group stepped forward with an offered hand. I'm Le Castellan, he said with his suave smirk. Their host narrowed his eyes at the boy slightly, but shrugged and took the offered hand. It is nice to meet you, Luke, he said politely, though with a subtle edge to his voice. Thalia sighed lowly, and shook her head before stepping forward. And I'm Thalia Grace. And you are? She asked rudely, understandably not trusting the man. She didn't know what it was, but their host just seemed off. Like there was more to him, much more to him, almost a sinister aspect to him. Their blonde host looked at the girl for a moment before tilting his head to the side in confusion. You know, that is a good question. It's oh wait, it's on the tip of my tongue. Darn, I fear I've forgotten my name again. Young miss, I do apologize, he said as he scratched his whiskered cheek with a nervous chuckle. How could you forget your own name? Annabeth cried out in confusion. The blonde host turned towards the girl before ruffling her hair with his right hand. That Thalia took notice that it was covered in white bandages. I don't know, young one. I guess after a while with no one saying it, it just sort of slipped my mind, he said as a sad look crossed his face. He sat quietly for a second, looking off into space for a moment before his eyes lit up like he remembered something. In fact, I think you are my first guests since that young mother and her baby came here. Raina? I can't quite remember her name. It was a long time ago though, he mused while he tapped a finger against his chin. They stayed here for about, I don't know, 20 years? Yeah, I think that's it. Little Zeke and his lightning powers. At least I think his name was Zeke. Could have been Zook. Zach? Whatever. I helped raise that little tyke and showed him how to bend the wind and lightning to his will. As he continued to ramble on, Thalia, Luke, and Annabeth shared a look between each other. This guy was crazy. Their host got up from his spot next to Annabeth and started to pace around the cabin as he talked about a mother and child coming to his cabin, hiding from the father because of an abusive relationship. Thalia leaned over to Luke. What should we do? She whispered to him in concern about being in the same place as a lunatic for too long. Luke thought for a moment before responding. So far he hasn't acted hostile. In fact, I think he just likes having someone to talk to. I say we stay until morning and then leave as soon as we are ready in the morning. Thalia nodded to her friend and went back to whatever story their host was telling. Oh, but before those two, I had a visitor. She was the first to visit since that old man made this cabin for me. Little Pebble was cute back then. Now she's all grown up, I think. Haven't gotten to talk to her since she left to be back with her husband. He mused again. Now he was in the kitchen making something. I hope you guys like ramen. It's literally the only thing I remember how to make without burning, he said as he set 3 large bowls on the small table in his kitchen. He picked up a 4th bowl and walked over to Annabeth and handed it to her. Careful dear, it's very hot, he said as he also handed her a towel and a pair of chopsticks and a spoon. Thank you, Annabeth said quietly as she looked at the bowl of noodles in her lap. The man smiled broadly and walked back to the kitchen table and took a seat in front of one of the other bowls. Just before he began to dig in, he looked back to Thalia and Luke with a raised eyebrow. Well, come on, it'll get cold if y'all let it sit for too long, he said as he raised his chopsticks and clasped his hands together. Itadakimasu, the man cried out before diving into his food. Thalia and Luke watched as their host inhaled his food like he hadn't eaten in years. After what seemed like a single second, the blonde man was draining the broth from his food and set his bowl down with a blissful sigh. Man, had all the centuries have been without the taste of ramen, he said with closed eyes and an airy smile. He cracked a single eye open to look at the two children sharing his table. Well, come on children, dig in, he urged the two. Thalia looked to Luke before turning back to the bowl of broth-covered noodles. She let out a low sigh before bringing some of the boiled dough up and taking her first bite, and then a second bite, and then she and Luke jumped into the bowls with gusto. By the gods, this is good, Annabeth called out from the couch as she finished her bowl. Thalia and Luke readily nodded in agreement as they drained their bowls and set them down with shocked looks on their faces. Their host sported a grin so large that it forced his eyes to close, giving him a fox-like expression. I've still got it, it seems, he exclaimed with a wide smirk. Can't believe I cooked it right after not serving it in about 5,000 years, he mused as he stood from his seat and went to the hearth. However, he didn't take notice, or if he did, he very obviously didn't care, to the fact that both Thalia and Luke began to choke and flail around, spinning to stare at their host. Did you? Thalia began to sputter out before Annabeth finished for her. 5,000 years, she cried as she looked at the men in shocked confusion. Taking a seat and poking at the flames, their blonde host froze as his face went blank. He seemed to just sit there for what seemed like hours to the three children. He was dead to the world until Thalia walked up and snapped her fingers in front of his face, making the blonde shake his head and look at her. Sorry, did I zone out on you? He asked with sheepish grin. Thalia gave him a deadpan look and nodded her head. He chuckled slightly and scratched the back of his head. Well, sorry about that. Why don't you kids get some rest? You all must be exhausted from all that running, he said as he stood from the hearth and moved towards the couch where Annabeth was lying. As he took the bowl from the little girl's hands, he draped a soft blanket over her. Where he got it, no one knew. Thalia was about to start up her interrogation of the men when she felt something come over her. Her eyelids grew heavy and her legs grew weak. Annabeth let out a long yawn before curling up on the couch, falling asleep quickly. Luke quickly got up from the table, only to fall to a knee, his eyes struggling to stay open. Before he could get back up, he finally succumbed to whatever was taking over, and fell to the ground asleep. Thalia watched as the blonde man walked over to her friend. She tried to get up and stop him, but her body was too heavy to move on her own. And no stop, she groaned out as she struggled to stay awake. She watched the man pick up her friend and lay him next to the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, and resting on a pillow. The host looked over her with a soft smile and walked over to her. Don't worry, little one, just rest, and learn from your dreams, he said before pressing his index and middle finger to her forehead in a quick press. All will make sense soon, she heard him say as her eyes grew too heavy to remain open, and finally fell into Morphe's realm. An unfamiliar city laid at rest for the night. The moon rose up high, the citizens resting peacefully. But all was not well. Some distance from the city, a new life was being born. There was a man and woman, in a small cave away from the city. The woman had finally finished going through labor, and her husband was smiling at her, congratulating her. But before either parent could hold their child, a masked man appeared and took the child. The father saved the newborn boy, but at the sacrifice of his wife. The father brought his son to a safe place before going to face the masked man again. But now, the masked man had a weapon of unparalleled power on his side. It was as big as a mountain, and its 9 swaying tails flicked out and crushed the city below it. The husband defeated the masked man, but before he could kill the man, he vanished. Now the husband needed to deal with the dreaded monster attacking his home. He led the beast from his home, and brought it to his son. With tear-filled eyes, he brought out a demon, a monster that was known as the Shinigami, to seal the beast away. At the sacrifice of his own soul, he sealed the monster away into his newborn son. And so, the boy's first hour in the world left him alone, and crying out for the ones who loved him. It was day now, and people were walking through the streets of the unknown city. A young boy, clad in orange, ran through the streets and over the rooftops, a megawatt grin across his face as he laughed and ran from his pressures. He had paint cans in his hands, and the grand monument that sat on the peak of the mountain overlooking the city had a fresh coat of graffiti on it. The boy was eventually caught and brought back to his school. At the end of the day he walked through the streets with his eyes downcast, the faint whispers all around him. The heated glares and the muffled curses all pointed at the lonely boy. The boy, however, just raised his head and glared back at them. He raised his fist and vowed. He poured his heart into his vow and his eyes filled with determination. "I swear I'll be Hokage one day. Then, you all will have to respect me and treat me as a somebody." The boy trained, he fought, and he grew. Soon, he was a young adult, standing before a ruined plain of land. That land was in fact the city he had known for so long. The boy had fought many battles. He had defeated a demon with his own 2 hands, battled the Lord of Snakes, fought with his traitorous friend, and even killed an immortal. But no one had been able to fight him on this level. He was beaten and battered. The man of 6 was down to 1 as he stood over him, the eyes of God staring into his soul as he prepared to finish the battle. But before he could, a young woman appeared and stopped the man. She fought as well as she could, but was struck down by the man. She stared at the boy and smiled at him, telling him all will be alright, that she looked up to him, that he inspired her to keep fighting, that she had fallen in love with him. And it was then, the man struck her down. And it was then that the boy fell into despair. The monster that once attacked his home, he nearly let loose again as he attacked the man. But he found his balance, he stopped his rampage, and finally, resealed the monster and defeated the man. He brought them all back. All those he had lost to the man of 6, they all walked again. He was hailed as a hero, his dream finally realized. He was looked at more than just a monster. He was the hero to the people, and loved by all. But his hardships weren't over. The masked man returned, and war was brewing. The boy rallied the world together to face this foe. The armies of men fought side by side against an army of the undead and false men. They fought through the day and night, and finally, men gained the upper hand in the battle. All before the masked man played his ace, a monster, ever larger than the beast the boy had sealed away. Its 10 tails changing the terrain and causing storm. Hundreds of men lost, thousands more changed forever. But the boy stayed. He fought alongside his friends, his family, and even the beast within him. And finally, he struck down the beast, only for the monster's creator to arrive and attack the boy and his friends. They fought through lands of ice, fire, and a land that which none could stand. The masked man changed his ways and fought alongside the boy, and he died for the boy. In a rage, the boy fought the goddess. He and his friends fought her and defeated her, but not before she cursed the boy. You insolent whelp, I curse you. I curse you to unending life. May you watch your precious world fall around you. May you walk through time knowing only solitude and despair. Walk alone through time, little boy. Walk alone for all eternity. With this I curse you. Uzumaki Naruto. Chapter 2, Names with Power. You insolent whelp, I curse you. I curse you to unending life. May you watch your precious world fall around you. May you walk through time knowing only solitude and despair. Walk alone through time, little boy. Walk alone for all eternity. With this I curse you. Uzumaki Naruto. Annabeth's eyes snapped open as she let out a startled scream. She was covered in a light coat of sweat and her breath was ragged. The 7-year-old girl was shaking as she looked around the dark cabin, lit only by the dying embers of the hearth fire. She saw Luke laying in a blanket next to the hearth, sleeping peacefully and breathing with a steady pace, like he hadn't been bothered at all by her scream, almost like he hadn't even heard her. The blonde girl looked around some more before she noticed Thalia curled up in one of the armchairs, snoring softly and mumbling in her sleep. The young girl tried to stand up, but a jolt of pain in her ankle made her whimper and fall back into the couch. She began to panic, until she noticed something press into the couch next to her. She looked to her right and noticed a wooden crutch leaning against the cushion next to her, made to perfectly fit her height. And where it came from, she had no idea. She reached a tentative hand out for the crutch and stood slowly, trying to keep as much weight off her bad ankle as possible. She started to make her way through the dimly lit cabin and found the door to the porch. After she opened the door, she walked outside and was met with the cool night air and the gentle breeze. She looked around as she listened to the sounds of the woods around them, the sounds of crickets chirping, and toads croaking. She looked around and was struggling to keep her mouth from hanging open from the beauty of the clearing in which the cabin lay. Wildflowers lined the building and spread out around the flat land. Lightning bugs twinkled in the night and flew freely through the air. She looked until she found a lone stump of what she thought would be a once great tree. It had to be nearly 10 feet in diameter, and at the center of the cut tree sat their host, and she nearly gasped as she figured out what the horrible dream she had was about. Or should she say, who it was about? The cursed boy sat before her. His once bald and spiked blonde hair, cut down and finally tamed. His once explosive and shining eyes, dimmed and shut. His tan skin turned pale. Even his ever-present whisker marks were faded and less prominent than the boy of the dream. He sat there with his legs crossed and his hands folded in his lap, in the shape of some strange hand sign. Altogether, he had an ancient aura that surrounded him, and made him seem far older than he visibly was. Keeping his eyes closed, he let out a small sigh before beckoning for her to join him. Annabeth crawled onto the stump and shuffled to sit in front of him. She looked at him with expectant eyes as he remained motionless. After a pregnant pause, he finally spoke. "So, what have you learned from your dreams?" he asked in a quiet tone, almost like he didn't want to disturb the slightly unnervingly quiet night. Annabeth tilted her head to the side as she thought of a way to summarize what she had seen. But before she said anything, she took a closer look at his face. Over his eyelids was a reddish-orange tint that hadn't been there seconds ago, but she chose to ignore the change and continued to speak. "I know your name." She started to say before he held up his hand to silence her. "I'm sorry," he began. "But names hold great power, little one, and neither I nor the rest of the world is ready for my name to be spoken again quite yet. But for now, you may call me Kurama," he said as he opened his eyes and revealed that his once blue eyes had turned a deep amber that almost seemed to glow in the night, along with a cross-like design instead of a pupil. Annabeth slowly nodded, trying not to stare at his eyes. "Yeah. Okay. Kurama," she slowly said with a nod. "Well, to answer your question, I guess I saw your life," she said, not quite sure what he wanted to hear. Kurama nodded slowly before he gave her a small smile. True, that you did. But did you actually learn anything from viewing my past? Any valuable lessons to be known, any truths that have been revealed?" he asked the girl, getting a confused look from her. She tilted her head to the side trying to think of something. Kurama smirked at her and nudged her a little. "Come on, you're a wise one, child. What was the lesson in viewing my past?" he asked the girl. She continued to think, but she couldn't find the answer. She shook her head and looked at him sheepishly. "I am sorry. I don't know what I learned," she said before looking at him with a hopeful expression. "Can you tell me?" she asked him, only for him to shake his head no. "I'm sorry, but it is a lesson you must learn yourself. But I can give you some advice. Stay close to your friends. They will make you much stronger than you will ever be alone," he said to her with a smile. Annabeth let a small smile grace her lips as she sat next to Kurama. So she started, her curiosity rising. "Where are we exactly?" she asked with a pleading look in her eyes, almost like not knowing was going to drive her insane. Kurama chuckled as he patted the girl on the head with a smile. "All right, that I can tell you," he said to her before he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "We are in a space created for myself that is completely cut off from the outside world and the domains of the ones you call gods," he began as Annabeth sat up straighter and began to take mental notes. "Thousands of years ago, long before the gods existed, and even before the Titans, my people roamed the world. But, as you saw in your dream, we were a war-torn people, and eventually we lead ourselves to self-destruction. And that's when they ended their first game," he finished with a slight growl. "Game?" Annabeth asked in confusion. "What game? And who were they?" Kurama sighed deeply, but before he could answer her, something caught his eye. A large gray-furred wolf, about the size of a lion, walked into the clearing and slowly made its way over to where the two of them were sitting. As it stood in front of Kurama, it looked at him dead in the eyes before taking a few steps forward. Annabeth looked at the wolf with wide eyes and began to back away from it, but she was stopped by Kurama's voice. My. What brings you here, young one?" he asked the wolf as it stepped closer, and closer until it sat on the stump next to the blonde, sniffing him curiously. After a moment, the blonde reached up and began to scratch the large wolf behind its ears, earning a pleasant whimper from the beast as it laid down next to the man. "Such a strong being you are, but just a big softy on the inside, aren't ya?" he said as he continued to pet the large beast. Soon after the wolf laid down, several other wolves entered the clearing and trotted over to the blonde. "Oh? And you brought your family along with you," he said as he watched these wolves enter the clearing and approach him faster than the first had. There were 12 in total as they circled and sat around the blonde, enjoying his presence. Kurama chuckled as he patted one of the wolves next to him on its stomach. He looked off into the tree line surrounding them and smiled softly. "Well, I have met the pack, but I still need to be introduced to the hunters. Why don't you all come out so that we may talk to one another?" he said in a kind tone, scratching a wolf on the stomach as he said so. Annabeth raised an eyebrow at the man before she saw what he was talking to. Several women walked into the clearing, all holding silver bows with their arrows drawn back and aimed at Kurama. Wait, she couldn't really call them women, they were all too young for that. They were girls, none of them any older than Thalia. And they made a path for a young girl to walk past them. She looked no older than 12, but she carried herself with a certain confidence that showed maturity and experience. She had shoulder-length auburn hair and startling silver eyes. Her bow was strung across her back along with her quiver, and 2 large sax knives were holstered on her sides. She stood in front of Kurama with a slight scowl on her face. "Where is Thalia Grace, man?" she asked while adding a slight hint of vehement to the word man. Kurama didn't let her words provoke him however, as he just smiled at the girl. "My, you are a strong-willed young one. You remind me of a friend I once had several years ago," he said, still petting one of the wolves that had decided to rest his head in his lap. The girl narrowed her eyes at Kurama and crossed her arms. "I don't care for your tone, man. Tell me who you are and where Thalia Grace is," she demanded. Kurama arched an eyebrow before chuckling. "That doesn't seem to be any way to speak to your elders there, miss. But if you are looking for Miss Grace, then she is inside the cabin resting from her journey," he told her while waving his hand towards his cabin. The girl gave him an annoyed look before she started to move towards the cabin, only to be stopped by the man's voice. "Though, if you are looking for her, I would like to know why. I can't have one of my guests harmed while on my watch, in case that is why you are here," he told her in a serious tone while giving her a hard look. The girl looked at him for a moment before one of her hunters spoke up from the group. "How dare you speak to Lady Artemis like that, you pig of a man?" one of the girls shouted as she aimed her bow at him and prepared to let an arrow fly. But, as the arrow left her weapon, it stopped. It sat in the middle of the air as the man looked right at her with hardened eyes. Soon all of the hunters were restricted by tendrils of wood that sprouted from the ground, wrapping around their ankles and arms, holding them still. Artemis spun on him with her sex knives drawn, only to be restricted in the same way as her hunters. Her eyes widened as she found she couldn't break her restraints with even her godly power, and she could even feel her strength slowly leaving her body. Like the wooden trap was slowly sapping her of power, and lulling her into sleep. Annabeth watched with awestruck eyes as Kurama halted all 20 hunters and their mistress without moving an inch, not even bothering the wolves that sat with him. The hunters struggled in the restraints as Kurama looked at them. "This place is a sanctuary for those in need. There will be no violence here that would put those resting here in danger. Now, lower your weapon so that we may speak civilly, or I will keep you restrained for the rest of your stay," Kurama warned them as his eyes began to glow with an eerie golden glow. Kurama looked to Artemis and waited for her response. The goddess glared at him for a long moment before she growled and looked to her hunters. "Lower your weapons," she growled as she dropped her knives to the ground. Soon after she let go of her weapons, hunters dutifully followed her lead and dropped their weapons. Before their weapons could touch the ground, more tendrils made of wood appeared and confiscated them, keeping them out of reach. "You will get those back when you leave," Kurama told them as he released them from their restraints. "Now, Artemis, was it? It is time to answer my question. Why have you come, and how did you find this grove?" he asked in a no-nonsense tone. The goddess glowered at the men before she huffed in annoyance. "My father started to panic when he could no longer see or even sense Thalia, so he sent all of the available gods out to find her. And I found this place because I am the goddess of the hunt. There is no prey that can hide from me, even in cut-off realms such as this," she explained while glaring at the man. "Now, I will go and collect Thalia Grace and be on my way," she said as she turned towards the cabin, only to be stopped when she noticed a thicket of branches blocking the door to the cabin. "Sorry, but I cannot let you disturb her dreams at the moment. She is learning a valuable lesson about the world and needs to see it through till the end," he said as he finally stood from his place on the stump and walked towards the back of the cabin. Artemis turned on her heel and glared at him. And what gives you the authority to tell me what I can and cannot do? You are just a mortal man. What power do you have over the gods? She asked in annoyed rage. Kurama looked at her for a moment before ignoring her question and walking away. One of them has woken up. Please remain here until I return, he said as he disappeared from sight. A small boy sat alone in the dark. He was crying and holding his knees to his chest. He was alone. He was afraid. And he had no one to help him. In fact, he could hear banging on the door to the dark room he was in. The voices called out in anger, fear, and hatred. Demon, monster, murderer. The voices threatened the boy with death. They spoke with contempt for the boy. And the only thing he could think was why? The boy grew older, and he grew numb to the voices. He let them wash over him, barely giving them any acknowledgement. He was still alone, but he was no longer afraid. He put on the mask of happiness, pulling pranks on those that hated him, longing for any form of attention. He grew again, a boy no more. He fought with many great beasts. He held the conviction to protect those precious to him. He even protected those who once hated his very existence. The hatred that he was showered in as a child showed him humility. He knew his own faults and grew from them. The boy who was shown nothing but hate grew into someone who showed nothing but love. He hated no one, and he no longer longed for attention. He fought hard to earn respect, and he finally achieved it. All throughout his life he hated no one. He was a pariah amongst pariah. But he was a light in the dark for all. Luke's eyes opened wide as he sat up in shock. What had he just seen? He looked around the room to the cabin and noticed that Annabeth was missing from the couch, and Thalia was sleeping peacefully on one of the armchairs. Luke scrambled to his feet and rushed for the door. He jiggled the handle a few times but noticed that it was locked and began to panic. But once he looked back through the cabin, he noticed that there was an open door leading outside. And in view was a large black stone with flowers surrounding it, almost like it was a memorial. Luke made his way outside and looked at the stone before him. There was writing on it that he couldn't read, and yet, he felt obligated to continue looking, reading this strange print. The sounds of footsteps cut him out of his trance as he turned and saw their host looking at him with an arched brow. So, Luke Castilian, what have you learned from your dreams? Chapter 3, the second lesson. He jiggled the handle a few times but noticed that it was locked and began to panic. But once he looked back through the cabin, he noticed that there was an open door leading outside. And in view was a large black stone with flowers surrounding it, almost like it was a memorial. Luke made his way outside and looked at the stone before him. There was writing on it that he couldn't read, and yet, he felt obligated to continue looking, reading this strange print. The sounds of footsteps cut him out of his trance as he turned and saw their host looking at him with an arched brow. So, Luke Castellan, what have you learned from your dreams? Luke looked at his host, whose eyes had changed from the shocking blue to a nearly glowing amber, accentuating the cross-like design that was now his pupil. The blond boy shuffled back away from him in fear. Who are you? He called in fright and continued to back away, until his back touched the cold stone of the monument, forcing him to stay in place. The whiskered man sighed as he stopped his advance. Why do you hold so much hatred in your heart, Luke Castellan? What angers you so? He asked in a calm and inquisitive tone. Luke's eyes narrowed at him in confusion as he reached for the weapon at his waist. I'm warning you, tell me what you are. He ordered as he drew free the sword his ever-loving father decided to gift him with. He loathed having to use it, but whatever kept him alive at the moment was welcomed. The blond host sighed as he took another step forward. Turn around, Luke, and tell me what you see, he said to the boy, his voice remaining calm and quiet, even with a length of celestial bronze pointed at his person. Luke leveled the blade at him with hardened eyes. His muscles tensed as he prepared to fight, or run. No, you tell me what you are, or I will make you tell me, he commanded, his legs beginning to shake. His adversary kept his calm exterior, and continued to walk forward. Well, it's rude to demand answers when you yourself have yet to give any, Luke Castellan. So, will you tell me just who you hate so much? It's bad to just bottle all this in, the man at the point of the sword asked, keeping his eyes locked on Luke. The blond boy growled as he steadied his legs, and tightened his grip on his sword. What is this? A test? Are the gods testing me? Do they plan to toy with me again? He yelled out as his eyes narrowed. Well, I won't do it. I won't be a part of their games anymore. I have my own life, my own life. He cried. He raised his sword arm and quickly brought it down in a diagonal slash across the man's chest, only for the blade to pass straight through him, as if it were made of smoke. What? Luke breathed disbelief. How could this guy be mortal? His everything just screamed immortal, or even godly. Luke slumped to his knees as he stared at the man. Who are you? He asked in a quiet and defeated tone. The host just sighed as he moved to sit next to the boy. Just a man who has lived far too long. You can call me Kurama if you want, but I need to know. Is your hatred pointed at all of the gods, or just one in particular? Your father perhaps? He asked the boy with a tired, yet inquisitive expression, almost as if he had dealt with something similar and was not excited to have to deal with it again. Luke nodded absently before looking at the ground. He abandoned us, he's a god. And he just let my mother go crazy. He didn't even try to help her. All he's ever done for me was give the sword, and he didn't even do it personally, it just appeared at my doorstep. He rambled out as he slowly shook his head. Kurama looked at the boy with sad eyes before sighing. Truly. I am sorry for what you have had to go through, Luke. The neglection of parental love is truly a fate I do not wish upon even my worst of enemies. But, he started to say before turning to Luke, making the blonde look him in the eye. Hatred is not the way to counter neglect. Hatred is never the pathway to a better future. You do not have to forgive them, but do not hold it against them, and do not let your emotions rule you. I don't much about the world, but I do know some things. I know about the laws the gods have to follow, and I know there was nothing your father could have done without breaking these laws. He reasoned with the boy. Luke looked at him for a moment before he asked the even begging question, why? Why would he have a child with someone he couldn't be with? He asked in defeat, wanting, no, needing an answer. Kurama sighed and a soft smile crossed his face as he looked to the monument behind Luke. Sometimes, you just can't stop yourself from falling in love. Even if the consequences are high, love has a way of making someone do something they will regret down the line. But I don't think your father regrets having you, Luke. That sword should be evidence enough, he said as he gestured to the blade. He knew you would be in danger, so he gifted you something that would help keep you safe, so you could defend yourself. If that wasn't the act of a caring father, then I don't know what is. Luke stayed silent for a pregnant moment, contemplating Kurama's words. Was his father really looking out for him? He finally broke the silence when a new question entered his mind. But they're gods? Why would they need to follow any rules? He asked his blonde host. Kurama merely shrugged his shoulders in response. Maybe it has to do with the fact that they have such great power, that if they got too involved with the world, or did not have certain rules to follow, they would destroy the very things they represent, he cryptically explained. When Luke gave him a questioning look, Kurama sighed and tried to rephrase what he was saying. Okay, think of it this way. Is there a god of the sea? He asked suddenly as if trying to come up with something. Luke nodded. Poseidon, he said to the whiskered man who nodded in return. Yes, well, let's say Poseidon got a little angry one day and decided to flood the world out of spite, what would there be to stop him? If he did that, his domain would be the largest of anyone's and he would hold the most power. What keeps him from doing so? He asked the boy. Luke thought for a moment before answering. Well, there are the other gods who would retaliate. They wouldn't want for him to get even more powerful, with him already rivaling Zeus. He explained, gaining a nod from his host. Yes, the other gods could keep him in line, but what would really stop him from going through with it in secret? If none of the other gods knew what he was doing it, how could he not take all that power like that? He asked, now leaving Luke stunned and confused on how to answer. Kurama nodded at Luke's stumped expression and began to explain. That, Luke, would be the laws the gods follow. There were beings even before the gods, titans, and most of the primordials. These beings created a set of laws for the world, and if they were not followed, devastation and chaos would rain down on the world, crushing the being responsible. So, they obey the laws. Which, sadly involve some laws that I personally believe to be utterly pointless and cruel, like having to leave behind their children and those they so inconveniently loved behind. He explained to the boy, his voice trailing off towards the end, becoming lost and somewhat yearning. The two blondes sat in silence for a long moment before Luke once again broke the silence. So, what exactly is this a monument to? He asked as he looked over his shoulder to the black stone they were leaning against. Kurama raised an eyebrow and looked at himself before humming, a sad look entering his eyes. That, Luke, is a list of my regrets, he said in a quiet voice. And with that, Luke's jaw shut with an audible click. Kurama chuckled half-heartedly and with a wave of his hand, the once illegible writing morphed into modern-day English. Luke stood up from his seated position and looked at the stone, and a state of confusion washed over him. The writing on the stone was just a list of names. From top to bottom, they were names. Near the top of the stone it looked as if the names were professionally etched into it, but near the bottom, they were scratched into the stone with what could have been a shaking hand. Jiraiya Senjutsu ne Chizunaiki Rabi Gara Kakuro Iwaka Nechi Iwaka Hayashi Iwaka Hanabi Hate Kakashi Mato Gai Rockly Tenten Inizuka Kiba Abaram Shino Akimaki Chosai Kimaki Choji Kimaki Shoshu Yamanaka Inoichi Yamanaka Ino Yamanaka Inajin Sai Nara Shikamaru Narati Mari Nara Shikodani Nara Shikaku Nara Yoshino Sarutobi Kanu Hamaru Sarutobi Maji Udan Uchiho Sakura Uchiho Sarada Shukaku Matatabi Sobu Sangoku Kakuo Seiken Guki Kurama Uzumaki Boruto Uzumaki Himawari. The names went on until one last name was written. Its etching was the most legible, almost as if writing it was something the person spent several days on perfecting before they even approached the stone, as a last memorial to a person loved more than life itself. Uzumaki Hinata, she was my wife, he heard Kurama say behind him. Luke turned around to look at him with wide eyes. She was the first person to tell me they loved me, and I will never forget her, he said quietly as he looked at the name. Immortality is a nasty thing, especially if it is a curse. Luke, do not let your life be dictated by hatred. Life is far too short for such a thing. He taught me that, he said before he turned to leave. Luke looked at him and tried to say something, but was cut off by the man. Get some more rest, Luke, you have a long journey to go on tomorrow, Kurama said over his shoulder. Luke watched as the man walked away and back around the cabin, out of sight. As he disappeared around the corner, Luke looked back to the stone. Why is his own name on the stone? He thought aloud as he read one of the names, Kurama. Artemis watched the interaction between Blonde Man and the son of Hermes. At first she had been confused by his mention of dreams, and her confusion only grew as she listened to them interact. Luke suddenly became hostile towards the man, but his anger was subdued by words alone. For a man to be able to defuse a situation like that without the use of his fists was new? Or should she say, unexpected? Sure, she had seen men like that before, but not very often. Usually when a male is met with a sword pointed to his chest, he would retaliate. But this mystery of a person just kept moving forward, and was slashed at, only for her confusion to grow even further when the sword just went right through him, without damaging him. Caused red flags to go up in her mind. Just what was he? He wasn't a demigod, that was for sure. She would have most likely have heard one of the gods brag about him due to his power, but he also wasn't a monster. By all intents and purposes, he was mortal. But that couldn't be possible, he had strange, godly powers. Her thoughts were broken when 4 words left man's mouth. She was my wife. She heard him say, drawing the goddess's attention. She could hear the sadness in his voice as he spoke about her, and for a moment, she felt sorry for him. Thalia slept soundly, until the images started to play through her head. She tossed, and turned whimpering in fright. You insolent whelp, I curse you. I curse you to unending life. May you watch your precious world fall around you. May you walk through time knowing only solitude and despair. Walk alone through time, little boy. Walk alone for all eternity. With this I curse you. Uzumaki Naruto. A woman said this to a blonde teenager. The image shifted and 2 friends stood across from each other, blood staining their tattered clothes as they looked at each other with heated glares. The image shifted again, and the 2 friends laid side by side, both missing an arm, smiles across their faces. Another shift, and the blonde man stood together with a woman with lavender eyes and dark indigo hair. They stood in a large garden wearing ceremonial clothes. It was a wedding. They stood with one another as the image continued to shift. They stood together, then a small bundle was resting in the woman's arms. Another shift and the small bundle appeared to be a young toddler in his mother's arms as the blonde man held another bundle in his arms. The image continued to shift and the children and the woman aged. But the men did not. In the beginning the man had a large grin, but as the images shifted, the man's face became one of horror, guilt, and grief. While the ones he loved most aged, he stayed young. Eventually, the woman grew too old, and the man was distraught, kneeling behind a grave, weeping openly as his grown children tried to comfort him. The image shifted and the blonde man was walking out of the village he lived in, a small pack on his back as he walked away without looking back. And from afar, his dark-looking form that he had fought with, stood in the shadows still as young as the blonde man himself. The man wandered the world, standing before beasts that put the mountains to shame, and putting them into his own body. A massive monster of sand shifted and howled with crazed humor. A two-tailed cat, permanently lit aflame with azure flame, purred in the comfort of the sun. A three-tailed turtle, sitting calmly atop a lake. A four-tailed monkey resting amongst the jungle trees. A five-tailed beast that seemed to be a cross between a horse and dolphin, ran with glee through a vast plain. A six-tailed slug slumbered peacefully in a dark cave. A six-winged and one-tailed beetle flew freely through the skies. A eight-tailed ox roamed the cloudy mountain landscape, searching for companion. And finally a nine-tailed fox sat under a large red arch within a golden void, and standing in front of him was the blonde man. The two were heatedly discussing something, but their words went unheard. The image shifted again and the world was covered in fire. The blonde man stood atop a tall mountain, and he had fallen onto his knees, watching the world burn in utter horror. The dark friend, standing by his side with a similar look of horror. And then it all changed. The blonde man sat with his friend, alone in a vacant world. They stared at the sky until two beings appeared. One was an old man, a long beard stretching down to his waist was aged and graying. And his companion was a young woman. A flowing red dress was draped over her body as long black hair blew in the non-existent wind. "So, you are the only ones left?" the old man muttered out. The young woman looked to her companion and smirked. "Ha! Looks like I have won this game, you old codger!" she yelled out in victory as she looked back to the two defeated-looking men. "This world burned, just like I said it would." The old man huffed in annoyance before turning to the two men. "Yes, it seems that way. But I still have two pieces on the board. So I say this game is a draw," he declared, making the woman whine. "Oh, come on! What are we going to do with a draw?" she whined out childishly. The old man huffed yet again before turning to her. "We start over, but I keep my remaining pieces while you get the first move. That is fair, so do you accept?" he said to the woman. She thought for a moment before smiling and nodding. She held up a hand and the world began to shake. "All right, my first move is to reshape Terra and give it life," she said as the land shook harder and harder until the ground gave way between the two friends, sending them on opposite sides of a chasm. The old man stroked his beard as he thought to himself. "That is a rather good first move, Chaos. I am impressed. My first move shall be to give these two shelter from your power. They will be my ace," he proclaimed, waving his hand towards the two. Trees began to form around the two friends, and cabins were built from nothing but air. The woman pouted at the old man. "AWWW, that isn't very fun order. Fine, but I place a curse on them. If they are to leave their shelter, they will forevermore change the course of history. Yours will end and begin anew. This I cast upon you," she chanted at the two, their forms beginning to vanish in the trees. The old man huffed one final time before turning away. "All right then, Chaos, let us see how this game plays out." Chapter, a parting gift. The woman pouted at the old man. "AWWW, that isn't very fun order. Fine, but I place a curse on them. If they are to leave their shelter, they will forevermore change the course of history. Yours will end and begin anew. This I cast upon you," she chanted at the two, their forms beginning to vanish in the trees. The old man huffed one final time before turning away. "All right then, Chaos, let us see how this game plays out." Thalia's eyes slowly opened as she groaned awake. She slowly sat up from her spot on one of the lounging chairs next to the dying hearth and popped her stiff joints. She had another weird dream. But this one was different from the others. This one had nothing to do with trees or empty voids. No, this dream was about a completely different person and his own screwed-up life. Thalia let out a long yawn as she looked around the cabin and noticed that both Luke and Annabeth weren't inside the building. She would have panicked if she didn't see that the back door was open and Luke was sitting in front of some stone monument. Thalia got up slowly as she kept stretching and began to walk towards the door. And then she remembered something. That jackass drugged us. She mentally roared as she remembered how she had fallen asleep. That blonde jerk must have spiked their food and made them fall asleep. She knew he wasn't above doing that. She did just get done seeing the guy's past after all. When I get my hands on him, she grumbled as she walked out of the cabin. Hey Luke, you alright? She asked as she walked up to her friend. She had noticed the distant look on his face and looked at him with worry in her eyes. But it seemed she was worried for nothing, since apparently her voice was enough to knock him out of whatever funk he was in. He shook his head and looked up at her after blinking a few times. Oh, hey Thalia, you're up. So, you have your heart-to-heart with Kurama yet? He asked the punk-style girl, earning a confused look from her. What? Who the heck is Kurama? She asked in confusion. Luke blinked a few times in shock. Oh. Huh. Kurama's the blonde guy, you know, the one whose cabin this is. He explained. You did have a weird dream like me and Annabeth, right? Thalia blinked for a second before nodding. Yeah, what was yours about? Because mine was all kinds of messed up. She asked the blonde. Luke looked down for a moment, that vacant look returning to his eyes. Well, mine was about a little boy. He was hated by everyone for something he didn't know about, but he never held it against them. He just wanted to prove to them that he could be worthy of their respect, and that he could never hate anyone. He explained before looking to the stone behind him. Kurama talked to me after I woke up. He told me that life was too short to go on hating people, and acting solely on that hate. He said as he looked at the stone, a far-off look in his eyes. Thalia was able to put the dots together. Knowing Luke on a personal level, she knew he had a pretty deep grudge against his father for how his mother turned out. So, that blonde guy tried to talk him out of his grudge on Hermes, she thought to herself before she looked at the black memorial stone. Her breath caught as she found a name she recognized. It was the same name that was on the grave of the lavender-eyed woman in her dream. I knew he looked familiar, she mumbled to herself, a sad look entering her eyes. But that look only lasted for a short amount of time before it turned into one of fury. What kind of monster would play around with the lives of so many? Chaos? Order? They would treat the world and those who live in it like it was some sort of game. Well, Blondie really needs to go give those two a piece of his mind. She mentally snarled as she turned on her heel and began to walk away. Luke turned to her with a confused look. Thalia? Where are you going? He asked as she walked away. I'm looking for Kurama, she said over her shoulder and rounded around the cabin. Kurama sat where he was before, on the stump of a grand tree, observing the hunters set up camp. You know, I could make this go a lot faster if you'd let me help out, he called with an amused look as several of the hunters glared at him. One walked up to him and shook her head. I am sorry, sir, but we need not thy help to set up our camp, the hunter's lieutenant said with a face that said she was forcing herself not to scowl at him. Zoe Nightshade did not know why they were ordered to treat him with respect, but if her mistress ordered so, then she would obey, although she could not argue his power. He had successfully captured all of them, including Lady Artemis, without moving a single muscle. She looked at him, trying to keep her eyebrow from twitching as she noticed that their pack of wolves had taken to sitting with him again. The man waved her off with a wry grin. Fine, fine, I was just suggesting I make some cabins for you so you wouldn't need to set up tents. He offhandedly as he rubbed one of the wolf's ears, getting it to roll onto its side. It was at this point Zoe had enough. How are you doing that? She asked in annoyance. She had never seen the pack act so docile, especially around men. Before the blonde could respond, a voice cut him off from behind. He's channeling nature through his very being, making an empathy link to the pack, making them docile. Artemis said as she walked up from behind Kurama and sat down on the edge of the stump. But I want to know, is how you are doing it? Not only would you need to be a nature spirit, but you'd also need to be a godly being with nature being in your domain. So, what are you? She asked as she crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes at him in suspicion. Kurama looked at her with a deadpan stare before he shrugged. One of a kind, I guess, he said nonchalantly, blowing off your question. Artemis scoffed at him before scowling. Please don't speak like that, you remind me too much of my brother, she gritted out. And that wasn't the answer I asked for. I asked you what you are. Are you human, mortal, godly? What? She pressed, trying her hardest to figure out just what he was. Kurama took up a thinking pose before he smiled wide enough to make his eyes close, making him have a false-like look. Why, I'm just a tricky fox in disguise. And to answer your questions in order, no, no, and no. I am none of the above. I am simply me, he said before he stood up from the stump and jumped off. Besides, we have an angry girl roaming around looking for me. I'll see you around, he said as he disappeared around the cabin for a second time. Artemis just stared at where he was sitting in shock. Did he just blow us off while answering my question at the same time? She asked herself before growling out in frustration. He acts just like my idiot brother, she cried out in annoyance before looking to where she could hear a giggling girl. Annabeth was sprawled on her back playing with a few of the pups from the pack, letting them crawl on her and roll around. She looked to Zoe with a raised eyebrow. Sorry, Melody, but the man told her she could play with the pups. Zoe apologized. Artemis sighed while shaking her head and sitting back down. At least he doesn't act like a pig like Apollo. So, Thalia, you want to talk about your problems before they blow up? Kurama asked as he walked up behind Thalia, making the girl swing around to look at him. You! I've been looking for you for like 15 minutes. She yelled while jabbing a finger at him. Kurama shrugged before responding. You could have looked to the front of the cabin where all the noise is coming from. This got Thalia to climb up and stop talking. And just like that, the situation turned on its head. So, Thalia Grace, what have you learned from your dreams? Kurama asked with a serious tone to his voice. All of the noise from before went silent, as if it were only Kurama and Thalia standing in a quiet field. Well, besides the fact that the creators of the world are total jackweeds, you had a pretty crappy life, she said to him while crossing her arms, completely killing the serious feel that Kurama was trying to make. Kurama stared at her for a moment before a smile cracked onto his face. And then a chuckle, and then he started to blow into a heartfelt laugh. He sat down with a sigh to try and calm himself before he looked up to the punk girl. You just hit the nail right on the head with that, he said, still trying to hold off a snicker from how easily his life had been summed up. You know, that sounded like something I would have said when I was your age. But hey, great minds think alike, right? He said as he began to stand back up. But in all seriousness, Thalia, what have you really learned? He asked again, placing a hand on her shoulder. Thalia sighed and looked down to the ground. Our lives are nothing but pieces on a board. It's all a game, she said sadly, not wanting to believe that everything is just for the sick amusement of two higher beings. Kurama nodded to what she said. While it's sad, it is the truth, he agreed, but before the mood could take any further of a dive, a smirk appeared on his face. But you need to look on the bright side, he started, getting Thalia to look back up to him. It is still your life, make the best of it. Do what you feel, and enjoy your life however you wish. And if you find something worth fighting for, protect it with everything you have. Like I told Luke, life is short, shorter than anyone can ever realize, but that is precisely what makes it truly precious. Life only matters because it ends, so you must always strive to make the best of it, he said with a smirk, making Thalia smile at his optimism. Here was someone who had all the reason in the world to be cold, bitter, and hateful to the world. But there he stood, as happy as one could possibly be, in spite of all the difficulty, hardship, and pain he had experienced. He was still a kind, compassionate, and all-around decent human being, if that was what she could call him. He was a being that was older than the gods, or titans, or giants, or even most monsters, not to mention the human itself. So, that sounded like quite the pep talk. What do you got for me? She asked with a raised eyebrow. She already knew her own faults. Yeah, she was a bit abrasive. Sure, she could be a little violent. And heck, maybe she was a tad emotionally explosive. But what could this eternity-old being have to say to her that would be life-altering, like he had with Luke? She had already seen the biggest, ugliest secret the cosmos had to hold. What could be worse? Kurama sighed and looked at the girl with serious eyes. Oh. This couldn't be good, could it, Thalia? All I have for you is a warning. A piece of advice. One you will hopefully take to heart. He began before placing a hand on her shoulder. Be wary of those who grant life without thought. He told her, earning a strange look from the girl. Trust me, child. If you are ever offered the prospect of immortality, make sure you think very carefully before accepting. Take it from someone who has seen it all, and been through it all. Immortality is a curse. It ruins the cycle of life and death, and interrupts nature. Immortality is a risky business. Many think it's a blessing, but, after I've seen, I pity those fools. I'm not telling you to turn down immortality if you're ever offered, I just warn you to think before you make that kind of sacrifice. Thalia looked at the blonde man in shock, before she nodded, conviction in her eyes. I understand. It's not like I have a large chance of being immortal anyway. But I'll keep you in mind if the time ever comes up, she said to the blonde, earning a smile from the man. He held up his fist with a grin. Good, because I would like for at least one of my visitors to take my advice to heart for once. He exclaimed, earning a snort from Thalia. Yeah, based on what I've seen from you, I don't think you went and told my father to be a womanizer that cheats on his wife every other day, she said, lifting her hand to meet his, bumping his fist with her own. Kurama shrugged and let his eyes glow a little brighter. Yeah, I'll need to have a discussion with old Sparky Boom Man about keeping a healthy family lifestyle if I ever see him again. He chuckled out, his words holding a slight bit of venom held for the King of Gods. Thalia burst into laughter before she and Kurama began to walk back towards the front of the cabin. Thalia and Kurama walked up to see that the hunters finally finished setting camp and noticed that Artemis speaking with Annabeth, and Luke standing by on the porch to the cabin, rocking on one of the chairs while several of the hunters occasionally sent glares his way if they caught him looking at them. Thalia looked to Kurama with a raised eyebrow. When did they get here? She asked after nudging him in the side to get his attention. He hummed for a moment and shrugged. About an hour and a half before you woke up, he explained with a nonchalant tone before walking over to where Annabeth was. So little miss, how have the hunters been treating you? He said in a light-hearted tone as he walked up to Annabeth and placed a hand on her head, ruffling her hair, earning a whine from the girl. Artemis narrowed her eyes at him slightly but let it slide. Lady Artemis was just telling me about the hunters before you showed up, the little girl explained. Kurama made a quiet "oh" before turning to Artemis. Well, Lady Artemis, I would kindly ask you to hold off on transactions or blessing giving while you are here. They could possibly backfire due to you being cut off from your domains here. He warned the goddess with a knowing look. Artemis withheld a growl, knowing very well that she held almost no power in this realm, but that didn't mean she could plant the idea of joining her hunt in a possible addition. Very well, Kurama, I will save any more of my business for once we leave your grove, she said with a reluctant nod. Kurama smiled brightly at her while nodding. Good, now, why don't you and Thalia take Luke back into the cabin and rest a bit more? It's still the middle of the night and you three have a long journey before you. The next morning found Luke, Thalia and Annabeth standing with the hunters at the entrance of the grove, Kurama standing before them. He walked to Luke and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a knowing look. Remember, hatred will only lead to further suffering for both parties involved, he said in a hushed tone, earning a curt nod from the blonde boy. Kurama nodded before moving to Thalia. He gave her a smile before ruffling her spiked hair. Remember my advice, kiddo. You might just need it in the future, he said with a smirk as she whined and swatted his hand off her head. She gave him a half-hearted glare before he chuckled and moved on to Annabeth. Kurama gave the small gilf a warm smile before setting himself on a knee before her. Now, Annabeth, I have a final question for the wise girl, he said to the blonde girl, earning a slight giggle. What? She asked with a slight smile. Well, I see that Luke here has a sword, and Thalia has her shield and spear, but do you have any weapons? He asked with a knowing smirk. Annabeth pouted slightly before shaking her head. No, I haven't found one or have been gifted one yet, she explained, making one of the hunters perk up. Oh, you can have one of my, she began before Kurama held something up to Annabeth. The blonde girl gasped as she looked at the blade before her. It was a medium-sized dagger, or kunai if she remembered what it was called, but this one was special. This one had 3 blades, one main blade and 2 others working as guards of sorts. On its handle was a strange marking that made her head spin trying to understand, but before she could get a further headache she looked back up to Kurama. I think you know the importance of this blade, so I know you would do it in honor by using it for the right reasons. He began. Remember Annabeth, this blade was once my father's, so it is even older than myself, so make sure you keep it in top shape for combat, and one day, when you are in your darkest hour, when it seems you have lost all hope, pray on this blade, and throw it with all your might, and the light will appear to guide you out of the dark, he said before gently placing the blade into her hands. Now, it's time for you all to go. I don't think my old student will be happy if his daughters are out of his sight for too long, he said before gently nudging Annabeth to go. The hunters began to leave with the command of their mistress. Thalia and Luke gave one last appreciative look to their blonde host before following after the hunters. Annabeth began to walk away as Kurama stood. Goodbye Annabeth, may your wall of fire burn brightly for years to come, he said and began to walk away, only to feel a weight press into his leg. He looked down to see Annabeth giving him a hug with tightly shut eyes. This isn't goodbye. It's see you later, she said before Kurama smiled and scooped the girl up in a tight hug. Yeah. I'll see you later Annabeth Chase. Watch your friends' backs, they will always have yours. And with that his guest finally left his domain, the man out of time watching them leave until they were no longer within his sight, no longer within his realm. He sighed as he walked into his cabin. Watching them leave is always the hardest, he thought to himself before he noticed that the hearth fire was burning strongly, a young woman holding a poking rod, prodding the flames to life. She turned to him and smiled. I sensed the hearth was missing family once Artemis arrived, so I thought I'd come see if I could make the flames burn brighter for you. I hope you all liked the video, and if you all want the next part of this video please like the video and comment 3 hearts. Please subscribe to my channel so whenever I upload a video you will notify.